Most of you guys listening to this video, you're going to be already familiar with terminal services since it's a technology that's been around for many years. Terminal services is a thin client technology that allows multiple computers to log into a remote server and then use that machine just as if they were actually sitting in front of it. Fast forward to today. Windows 2008 R2 has been released and Terminal Services now has a new name. No longer is it called Terminal Services, it's now known as Remote Desktop Services. It's still pretty much the same Terminal Services though, with a few more options, but we're just going to have to get used to the new name. So if over the course of our Remote Desktop Services videos, I call it Terminal Services, just ignore that. The real term is Remote Desktop Services. I'm going to do my best to refrain from calling it Terminal Services though, but either way, we're referring to the same thing here. Now a little aside by the way, in this video, we'll be using Windows 2008 R2. Now if you're using regular old Windows 2008, then you'll still see this being referred to as Terminal Services, but we're still basically talking about the same thing. So if my copy looks a little different to yours, then that's why. Most of it's going to be identical, just a few subtle changes here and there, but we're going to talk about those anyway. In fact, whilst we're on the subject of name changes, in this table here, you're going to see down the left-hand side, we've got a table of things that you might be familiar with. Over on the right, in Windows 2008 R2, this will be the new name for the old technology. So Terminal Services is now called Remote Desktop Services. The terminal server itself is now called a Remote Desktop Session Host. And actually I would have thought that Remote Desktop Server would have been a better name, easier to understand. But when you think about Remote Desktop, as a general rule, if my Windows 7 machine uses Remote Desktop to access your Windows Vista machine, for example, I actually become the client and you become the server. So presumably, that's why Microsoft decided against calling a real terminal server a Remote Desktop Server. So either way, it's now called Remote Desktop Session Host. The Terminal Services Licensing, or TS Licensing, is now called Remote Desktop Licensing. The Terminal Services Gateway is now called Remote Desktop Gateway, or an RD Gateway. Our Terminal Services Session Broker is now called a Remote Desktop Connection Broker. And TS Web Access is now called Remote Desktop Web Access. Now some of the tools that we use to manipulate our terminal services has changed as well. Our Terminal Services Manager has now become the Remote Desktop Services Manager. Terminal Services Configuration is now a Remote Desktop Session Host configuration. The TS Gateway Manager is now Remote Desktop Gateway Manager. Licensing Manager, of course, is now Remote Desktop Licensing Manager. And finally, TS Remote App Manager is now just called Remote App Manager. So whether you like the new names or you hate them, unfortunately, that's what we're calling them now. If you're an old hand and you've been around terminal services for a while, it's going to take a little bit of getting used to. But if you're new to Remote Desktop Services, then you shouldn't have a problem with the new names. So how does Remote Desktop Services work? Well, for those of you that aren't up to speed on Remote Desktop Services and how it works, let's quickly talk about how it works and then we'll get on to discussing all of the technology that's involved. Now, in a Remote Desktop Services connection, we have two main players. We have a client component, which could be your local workstation, and then we have the Remote Desktop Server, which is a server running Windows 2008 R2. Of course, we could also call it a Terminal Services Server, running any version of Windows 2008 or earlier. So, on the client here, the user's going to fire up a remote desktop session to the remote desktop server, or perhaps they're going to double click on a special remote desktop icon to launch an application that runs on the server. So this application or desktop is actually running over here on our server, but the application appears to be running locally on the user's machine. So pretty much all that's happening is that the user's computer over here is sending mouse clicks and keystrokes from the keyboard over to our server, which then takes those clicks and presses and performs them on the server's desktop and the server's applications. Now everything here is done on the server, the CPU processing. This is done here on the server. The memory's all being used for that application on the server, the disk and the network access, all of it's being done on the server. So all this local PC, your workstation's doing, is basically replaying back to you the screenshots from the applications that are running on the server and sending it back over the network. Now to make things a little more efficient though, there are some things that do happen on the client side to save bandwidth. I mean, consider this. Every Windows application you use has some sort of graphics. Even if it's just a simple Windows title bar at the top, those are still graphics. And each time you move your mouse 1 millimeter on the screen, the Remote Desktop Services application, it needs to redraw that screen. So back on your local computer you can see that mouse cursor has been moved. Well, rather than having to send back the whole screen and all of the images, remember almost everything ever sent back to your client is images in a Remote Desktop Services connection. So by caching on the client all of these images, especially these images that rarely change, we can still view the screen the way it's intended to look, just without transferring the whole thing each time. Now the cool thing about Remote Desktop Services is that another user can now come along and he or she can have their own Remote Desktop Services session running on the Remote Desktop server, and even though their session runs on the same server, it's independent from all of the other sessions. Just like each user has their own server in a way. Really, they've just got their own session on the server. So in a nutshell, the application lives here on the server. The application is simply controlled here on the client. So if you're new to Remote Desktop Services or Terminal Services, the next question you might have is, well, I can do all of this on my computer. And Jordan can run those same applications on his computer, and Lucas can run the same applications on his computer. Why do I then need Remote Desktop Services for that? We could each have our own PC and say Microsoft Office installed on each of our computers, and we've got the same thing, right? Yeah, well, that is true. Each user can have their own PC and their own copy of Microsoft Office, and you basically have the same thing. So let's talk about why implementing Remote Desktop Services is a good thing. So let's consider using Microsoft Office here as the target application. Now as an administrator, let's say you've got 200 users in your company. Each user needs a copy of Microsoft Office. So you could A, go around to each PC and you can install Office manually. Good luck with that. You could B, we could use group policy. We could deploy Office to each machine using group policy. C, well, we could spend some more money on some other third-party software distribution product like System Center Configuration Manager. Or D, we could install Remote Desktop Services, and then we could install Office once only on the Remote Desktop server. So out of these options, which would you choose? Now, although it would want to be a pretty beefy Remote Desktop server to support the amount of users I mentioned, 200 users, the truth is though, this is one of the main advantages to Remote Desktop Services. As an administrator, you can manage that one single Remote Desktop server from a central location, and you really only need to install Microsoft Office once. If there's patches to download and install, you only need to install them once. Since each user connects to the Remote Desktop server, when you update anything on the server, each user automatically gets that update, since each user is using that one single application. So that's certainly one of the biggest advantages to using Remote Desktop Services. Management. You've got one server to manage, well, maybe more than one depending on your needs, but whether you have one server or you've got 10 of them, managing those servers is a heck of a lot easier than managing 200 users' computers. Now the next advantage is you can keep your computers, your hardware, around longer. When you've got 200 computers in the field, the last thing you want to do is replace all of them on a regular basis, just because your old computers won't run Windows Vista or Windows 7 very well. With remote desktop services, all of the processing is done on the server, meaning you can have a regular PC which mightn't have the processing power required to run new applications, but they'll run fine on your legacy computer, since the desktop machine itself isn't really doing much. It's just responding to screen updates and sending clicks and presses. So you can get a longer life out of your existing machines, and that'll save you a bucket load of money. I'd say backups is certainly another bonus. From an administrator's point of view, it's really frustrating to have some users save their data to their own local documents folder, which is not likely to be backed up. Data that's saved in a remote desktop services session can be saved out to a central location, which is highly likely to be included in your backup process. Arguably, a remote desktop services session is also going to be more secure than the old client-server model as well, since applications that are business critical, they can be removed from users' desktops and notebooks, and those applications stored on secured servers in the workplace. Now, a remote desktop services session really is also more flexible than a regular desktop session, since you can literally access the remote desktop server from anywhere and have the same applications accessible, something that isn't always possible from a desktop or a notebook computer. Now finally, a remote desktop services session also has the advantage of being more compatible. You know, when you have a lot of applications installed on your workstations, it's possible that one application doesn't work very well, or it doesn't play very nice with another application, causing you problems. Now when you have lots of applications, it's also possible that the next version of Windows doesn't like that application. For example, look, we live in times now where many companies, they're still running Windows XP, and it's likely that over the coming year, a lot of these companies will make the jump to Windows 7. Now that potentially means that there could be a lot of incompatible applications that simply don't work under Windows 7. Now if those applications are running on a remote desktop session host, and let's call it by the right name now, a remote desktop session host, which is just simply our remote desktop server. If those applications work on this server, then they'll work on Windows 7 as well. Alright, well let's move on and talk a little bit more about the various components of remote desktop services, since there's more than just this remote desktop session host to our overall remote desktop services experience. When we install remote desktop services, the first role you'll need to install is remote desktop services itself. This is the component of remote desktop services that provides this core thin client functionality that we've been talking about in this video. Now next we have remote desktop licensing, which, as the name suggests, is a role service that we can use to license our remote desktop licenses. As expected, each connection to remote desktop services requires a client access license, commonly called a CAL. In fact, you'll see Microsoft refer to them now as an RDS CAL, or Remote Desktop Services Client Access License. So we can use this remote desktop licensing role service to help us manage all of our licenses. Now next we have Remote App, formerly known as TS Remote App, and this allows you to have applications that are installed on the server available to be used by your clients through icons that you can install on the Start menu or through the remote desktop web connection. So on a regular Windows computer, you'd access programs by clicking Start, and then you'd launch the application from your normal Start menu. When we use Remote App, you can have remote desktop services applications also displayed on your Start menu, but when you run them, they actually run on the server, but they appear to be a normally installed local application. Really cool stuff, and we're going to show you how this works in another video. Now, remote desktop web access. This is another role that allows you to access your remote desktop applications from within a web page. Now this is really cool because it makes it really easy for your users to access a specific web page, like an intranet page, or even a web page accessible over the internet if you so desire, and they can access that application from the web page. Again, something we're going to talk about a lot in later videos. Now, when you have larger environments and you need multiple remote desktop session hosts, you can use the remote desktop connection broker. And you can use this to manage these servers in a farm. The remote desktop connection broker, which is formerly known as the TS session broker, also allows users to access remote apps and desktop connections and supports reconnecting to disconnected sessions. Now, remote desktop gateway, this is also another role, formerly called the TS gateway. This remote desktop gateway allows you to give your users the ability to access resources on your internal private network from pretty much anywhere in the world using any device that supports the remote desktop connection client. So pretty much all you need is this role installed, and then your clients can communicate with the server over HTTPS using an encrypted connection without needing a VPN connection. Another feature of this remote desktop gateway is that it also can be used as a NAP enforcement point. And if you want to learn more about NAP and how it works, be sure to check out our videos on that topic. NAP, Network Access Protection, it's a really interesting subject, and I'd recommend that you take a look at our videos. So in this video, we've talked about remote desktop services, formerly called terminal services. We've learnt what remote desktop services is, what it does, and the various role services and components that are going to make up your potential remote desktop services deployment. So over our coming videos, you're going to see how we can configure these various roles, and since remote desktop services is such an important service and such a common service, it's something that Windows administrators really need to know and understand. So we hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for watching.